In 1921, in a quiet town most people have never heard of, a man named William Carter made a decision that looked ordinary at the time. He wasn't born into wealth. There was no inheritance waiting for him, no sudden breakthrough, no lucky break, just a small trading shop, a notebook, and a way of thinking that no one around him seemed to understand. He didn't chase money the way others did. He didn't spend when business was good, and he didn't panic when things slowed down. Instead, he built slowly, almost quietly, buying small pieces of land when no one cared, reinvesting profits back into his work, and keeping records of every decision he made. To outsiders, it looked like patience. To his family, it became something else entirely. By the time William passed on, he hadn't just left behind money. He left behind structure. His children didn't simply inherit assets, they inherited rules. Rules about how money was used, how decisions were made, and most importantly, how responsibility came before access. His son, James Carter, grew up watching this. He didn't receive wealth all at once. He was introduced to it slowly, tested through small responsibilities, taught how to manage before he was ever allowed to enjoy. While others his age were spending freely, James was learning how to protect something bigger than himself. Years passed, then decades. Today, more than 100 years later, William's great-grandchildren live lives that seem almost effortless from the outside. They have options, freedom, stability. But what's most interesting is this: they don't behave like people who are trying to prove they're rich. There's no urgency, no desperation, no reckless spending, just quiet control. And here's the part most people don't see. There were moments when the family could have lost everything: economic downturns, bad business cycles, opportunities that looked tempting but carried risk. Yet somehow, they never went broke. Not in one generation, not in two, not even in three. While most families build wealth and lose it within a few decades, this one held on to it and grew it across an entire century. So the question is, what did they understand that most people don't? Because it wasn't luck. And it wasn't just about making money. It was something deeper, something invisible, something that quietly shaped every decision they made, generation after generation. Wealth is not what you think. If you asked most people what wealth is, they would give you a number. A salary, a bank balance, maybe a business that brings in consistent income. And on the surface, that makes sense. Because for most people, money is something you earn, something you increase, something you try to hold on to before it slips away again. But that's exactly where the misunderstanding begins. Because earning money and keeping wealth are two completely different games. William Carter understood this long before anyone around him did. To him, money was never the goal. It was a tool, something that moved, something that required direction. And without structure, it didn't matter how much of it you had. It would eventually disappear. That's what most families never realize. They focus on income, but ignore behavior. They chase opportunity, but ignore discipline. They increase what comes in without controlling what stays. And over time, that gap becomes everything. In most households, money decisions are emotional. They are influenced by pressure, comparison, lifestyle, and timing. When more comes in, more goes out. When things feel uncertain, fear takes over. There are no rules, only reactions. But in families like the Carters, money is not reactive. It is structured. There are expectations, boundaries, systems that guide decisions long before emotions get involved. Because wealth, in its true form, is not about how much you make. It's about how consistently you behave. This is the invisible rule. While most people think in months, next salary, next bill, next purchase, wealthy families think in decades. They are not asking, what can we afford right now? They are asking, what preserves this over time? That shift changes everything. It's why James Carter wasn't handed wealth the moment he was old enough to spend it. He was taught how to think before he was allowed to act. He learned that access to money without discipline is not a reward, it's a risk. Because without control, money amplifies behavior, and behavior over time determines outcome. That's why some people earn millions and still end up with nothing, while others build something smaller but structured, and it lasts for generations. In the Carter families, wealth wasn't just passed down. It was protected by rules that everyone understood, even if they were never spoken out loud. Rules about patience, about responsibility, about separating what you have from how you feel. Because emotions change, markets change, circumstances change, but structure, when built correctly, remains. And that's what most people miss. Wealth is not a number sitting in an account. It's a system that controls decisions, generation after generation. And once you understand that, you begin to see why some families never lose it. The system that keeps wealth alive for generations. By the time James Carter had children of his own, the family had already built something most people would recognize as wealth. There were properties, businesses, and investments quietly growing in the background. From the outside, it would have been easy to assume that his children would simply step into comfort. But that's not how it worked. In the Carter family, wealth was never treated as something you receive. It was something you learned to carry. James didn't sit his children down and tell them, "One day, all of this will be yours." Instead, he introduced them to responsibility long before he ever introduced them to ownership. At the age of 12, his eldest son Michael was given a simple task: not money, not assets, a small responsibility tied to one of the family's rental properties. He was asked to track expenses, maintenance, repairs, tenant payments. Every month, he had to report what came in, what went out, and what was left. At first, it felt insignificant, just numbers on paper. But over time, something changed. Michael began to see patterns. He noticed how small costs added up, how delayed maintenance became expensive, how consistent income depended on consistent management. He wasn't just observing wealth. He was learning how fragile it could be without attention. Years later, when he finally gained partial access to that same property, it didn't feel like a gift. It felt like a responsibility he already understood. That was the system. In most families, money is given first, and understanding comes later, if it comes at all. In the Carter family, it was the opposite. Understanding always came before access, because they knew something most people ignore. Giving wealth without preparation doesn't create freedom, it creates risk. This is where the ownership mindset is built. To the Carters, owning something didn't mean enjoying it. It meant protecting it, improving it, and making sure it continued to exist beyond you. Assets were not trophies, they were systems that required attention. That's why spending was never the focus. Management was. There were moments when this system was tested. At one point, during an economic downturn, the family had the opportunity to sell a large piece of land at what seemed like a very attractive price. Many around them were doing the same, cashing out, securing immediate profit, reducing uncertainty. For a moment, it looked like the logical decision. But James made a different call. He chose to hold. Not because it was easy, but because it aligned with the system they had built. That land wasn't just value in the present, it was potential in the future. Selling it would have solved a short-term concern, but it would have broken a long-term advantage. Years later, that same land became one of the most valuable assets the family owned. That single decision reflected something deeper. In the Carter family, wealth was not managed based on pressure. It was managed based on principles. Another rule was just as important. Access was always delayed. Even as the family grew and assets expanded, no one simply arrived into wealth. Each generation had to go through a process, learning, testing, proving discipline over time, not to restrict them, but to prepare them. Because the goal was never to create individuals who depended on wealth. It was to create individuals who could sustain it. Every member of the family had a role. Some managed businesses. Others oversaw investments. Some handled operations. Others focused on expansion. But no one was disconnected from responsibility. There were no passive beneficiaries. And that's what kept everything alive. Because when wealth becomes something you simply enjoy, it slowly disappears. But when it becomes something you actively manage, it evolves. That's the difference. The Carter family didn't stay wealthy because they had more money. They stayed wealthy because they built a system where money was controlled, understood, and respected long before it was ever used. And once that system is in place, it doesn't just protect wealth. It multiplies it, quietly, consistently, across generations. Why most families lose it? There's a pattern that shows up so often, it almost feels inevitable. The first generation builds the wealth, the second maintains it, and the third loses it. Not always overnight. Not in one dramatic moment, but slowly, quietly, almost unnoticed, until one day, it's gone. And what makes this pattern so dangerous is that it doesn't look like failure while it's happening. It looks like comfort. The first generation, like William Carter, understands struggle. They've seen what it means to have nothing, so every decision is careful. Every risk is measured. Every gain is protected. They don't just value money. They respect what it took to earn it. The second generation grows up differently. They see stability. They benefit from structure. If they are taught well, they can maintain what was built. But even then, something begins to shift. The urgency fades. The pressure disappears. And with it, the sharp awareness that once protected the wealth. By the third generation, the environment has completely changed. There is no memory of struggle. No emotional connection to how the wealth was created. Only access. And that's where things begin to unravel. Because without understanding, money becomes easy to spend. Without structure, decisions become emotional. And without responsibility, wealth turns into lifestyle. This is how it disappears. Not through one bad decision, but through many small ones. A purchase here. A risk there. A belief that there's always more. Until slowly, the foundation weakens. What most families don't realize is that wealth doesn't need to be destroyed to be lost. It just needs to be unmanaged. And that's the difference. In families without systems, money flows based on feeling. When things are good, spending increases. When things feel uncertain, fear takes over. There are no rules, only reactions. And over time, those reactions compound in the wrong direction. Compare that to the Carter family. They had access to the same opportunities, the same markets, the same economic cycles. They faced downturns, pressure, and uncertainty, just like everyone else. But their decisions were never driven by emotion. They were guided by structure. Where another family might sell assets to maintain a lifestyle, the Carters adjusted the lifestyle to protect the asset. Where others saw money as something to enjoy, they saw it as something to manage. Same resources, completely different outcomes. And that's the uncomfortable truth. Wealth is not lost because people are unlucky. It's lost because the behavior required to sustain it is never passed down. No one teaches the next generation how to think, how to decide, how to delay, how to protect. They pass down money, but not the mindset that made it. So, the system breaks. And once it breaks, wealth doesn't disappear all at once. It fades. Quietly. Gradually. Predictably. Until the cycle starts again, with someone forced to rebuild from the beginning. Where generational wealth really begins. At this point, you might be thinking something simple. That's a powerful story. But that family already had something to build on. And that's exactly where most people stop. They assume generational wealth begins when money becomes large, when income increases, when life becomes more stable. But that's not how it works, because what you've seen in the Carter family wasn't just wealth. It was a way of thinking, a way of deciding, a way of living that existed long before the numbers grew. And that means something important. You don't start building generational wealth when you have millions. You start the moment you change how you relate to money. Right now, most people live as earners. They focus on what comes in: salary, business income, side hustles. And while that matters, it keeps them locked in a short cycle. Earn, spend, repeat. But builders think differently. They don't just ask, "How much did I make this month?" They ask, "What did I create that will still be here years from now?" That shift alone changes everything, because once you move from earner to builder, your decisions begin to slow down. You stop reacting. You start positioning. You begin to see money not as something to use immediately, but as something to direct carefully. And that's where the second shift happens, from spender to steward. A spender sees money as access, a way to enjoy, to upgrade, to experience, but a steward sees money as responsibility, something to protect, to grow, to pass forward in better condition than it was received. That doesn't mean you stop living. It means you start thinking beyond yourself. Even if what you have right now is small, the principle is the same. You can begin building structure today. You can begin separating what you earn from what you keep. You can begin choosing assets over appearances, consistency over urgency, because systems don't require size. They require intention. And once a system exists, even a simple one, it begins to shape your behavior. It forces discipline. It removes emotional decisions. It creates stability that doesn't depend on how you feel in the moment. That's how something small becomes something lasting. The Carter family didn't protect their wealth because they had more money. They protected it because they built something that could outlive them. And that's the real shift. You're not just working for income anymore. You're building something that continues, whether you're there or not. Because in the end, wealth was never about how much you make. It was about what survives after you.